So today we're going to talk about lines of text and paragraphs. Proper word spacing is really important in design. If words are placed too closely together, it'll force the reader to work hard, and it's really hard to distinguish one word from another. So this is an example of that. And if it's too loose, you get these things called rivers that sort of go between the lines, and it makes reading awkward. It really disrupts the eye movement from left to right. So this is kind of an example of proper word spacing and how it's more readable and more pleasing. And letter and word spacing is called kerning and tracking. And it's all about those negative gaps between letters. And we really take space between words for granted. The spoken language is perceived as a continuous flow, but there's actually slight spacing as we speak that we don't even notice. And spaces were invented after Greek alphabet to make words distinct units. So the alphabet can't function without silent marks and spaces. And in the letterpress, every space and every punctuation is carefully considered because you have to physically lay it out. So types should be set with uniform word spacing. So you can kind of see this. Justified settings create uneven word spacing unless you work hard to make the right rag. So if you justify, it means that you have kind of a straight line on the left and a straight line on the left. So it's really pretty in terms of it being this almost physical block. But it's hard to do because when you do this, you get these really awkward word spacings, and then you have to adjust. And inconsistent letter spacing can be really distracting. You can kind of see that down here, how there's little gaps, and then sometimes it's more tight. So it's important that as we design, we really think about keeping the paragraph and the spacing between these words and lines really consistent. Small type often benefits from additional line spacing because small type is harder to read and you have to focus on it, whereas large X heights also might require additional spacing. So it's just a little bit more legible. And long lines can require extra line spacing. So if you're thinking in terms of design, if you're designing with small type or large X heights or long lines, you might want to strategically space the lines a little bit more farther apart or a little looser. In general, the line length should be comfortable to read. If it's too short, it can break up the words or phrases. And if it's too long, the reader has to search for the beginning of each line. And this is sort of an example of lines that are too long. And this is lines that are too short. Sometimes for aesthetic effect, you might do really short lines or really long lines. But mostly you want to make sure that the length is the most legible. So this is an example of more legible, more comfortable to read. So thinking about that line length. Too short breaks up words and space, and too long, the reader has to really search for the beginning of the line. You also sometimes have, in design, these really interesting spaces that you might intentionally place when you're laying out the lines. They can be random or asymmetrical. There can be no predictable pattern in length, placement, or arrangement of lines, and it can work, but it all depends on what you're trying to communicate and if there's a reason for like really chaotic or asymmetrical line spacing, then that might be a strategy that you employ. There's also this sort of edge that you need to consider. And it's called the rag. And ragged text, hyphenation should be avoided at all costs. So if you look, these little lines here are kind of distracting and ugly. So you really want to make sure that if you're designing a paragraph, you're really thinking strategically about this rag. And an example of justified here It is acceptable to have hyphenation, and it often helps to eliminate rivers and awkward spacing. So if you have justified text, sometimes you want to hyphenate just to avoid those ugly rivers and make it a lot more legible. So with a rag, you avoid. With justified, it's much more acceptable. So you can kind of see rag is, somewhat up to the viewer, but this is an example of kind of an extreme rag where it's kind of awkward and maybe compromising legibility a little bit, not as pretty. Whereas this is more of an acceptable rag where you're thinking it's just a little bit less less varied with the line length, and that's much more legible, and it's going to be a little bit more easy to design with. So rivers are those awkward spaces between the words in a paragraph, and it's really important that you look for them and you try to eliminate them. There's nothing more hard to decipher than a large gap that's sort of unintentional between two words. So as you're designing your paragraphs this week in your exercise, I really want you to try to avoid the rivers and to clean them up so that you have a much more consistent word spacing and line spacing in your paragraph. You also have these things called widows and orphans that can be distracting. Sometimes you have to have them, but if you can avoid them, it's probably better. So a widow is a short line or word at the end of a paragraph, and an orphan is a short line at the top of a paragraph. So you can see there's lots of different strategies, and there has been historically lots of different strategies for putting in paragraphs into publications and manuscripts. This was really common in the 14th century, where the paragraph would almost wrap around these beautiful renderings. In the 15th century, you can see it's like one big block, one giant paragraph. And then in the 17th century, you're getting sort of more distinction between the paragraphs, and you notice these beautiful enlarged capital letters at the beginning of each of the paragraphs is sort of a design element that can make it look really beautiful. So sometimes you have indents and line breaks. This is an example of that. So with a paragraph, to distinguish each paragraph, you might put an indent at the beginning, or you could put a line break just right here where you just kind of, at the end, there's going to be a space where there's this line break and no indent. So it just kind of depends on what aesthetic you're looking for. And other strategies, you can have a line break and a 1/2 line space here. So there's like a little bit of a gap between each of the paragraphs, or a space between each of the paragraphs. And this strategy is called an outdent, where you're going to have the line kind of reach farther to the left. The first line reaches farther to the left than the rest of the paragraph. This is an example of extra space with no line break. So you can kind of see how each paragraph is getting distinguished by this little space at the end of the last word and at the beginning of the first word of the next paragraph. Occasionally, you'll see paragraphs sort of distinguished by symbols. Often when you do that, there's no line break or indent. And sometimes paragraphs can be really experimental. So if you notice, this is sort of modeling these sort of organic shapes. So the words are sort of placed inside of almost an organic half circle. And in this example, you see that the paragraphs are sort of distinguished with really big capital letters at the beginning of each word of each paragraph. And then they're sort of splitting it from the right to the left and alternating it every other paragraph. There's kind of a very symmetrical balance here, with each side sort of being weighted with the alternate paragraphs. Here's some great student samples of just sort of alternative paragraph design and having fun. sort of brainstorming different solutions for how they could lay out their paragraphs in a really creative way. So we're thinking about paragraphs in terms of typographic hierarchy and legibility. And so as we kind of go through this week, we're going to really be thinking about designing paragraphs and making each paragraph work within the overall design or layout. So sometimes when you're laying out a page, you really have to think strategically about the hierarchy. How are you going to create emphasis, and how are you going to lead the viewer's eyes? And there's lots of ways to do that. So some of the strategies we just looked at, this is a really, just a really common page layout where you'd have like a main head, and this is sort of the topic header. Then you have like a little bit of text here, and maybe it's over to the left a little bit. And then you have a subsection that's indented. And then there's other ways to do this as well. So you can see these are the exact same information here. And these are common typographic diseases. And so you can kind of see this strategy and this strategy. And then as a designer, you might compare and contrast and see which strategy was solving the problem the best, or which style you wanted to go with. And this might be something that you consult with your client about. So here are some examples, really experimental design. These are really cool, beautiful. And you can see that, typography is so evolved now with the creative brainstorming and solutions, and there's so much history to typography that as a typographic designer, you just have a lot of different paths that you can explore and take with your typographic layout. It's really beautiful. This is by Michael Bierut. This is from Pentagram. And so this week, we're also, we're working on really thinking strategically about our own paragraph design. Bradbury Thompson was a very influential designer, and he really inspired designers like David Carson, for example. And in this layout, you can see that he's really intentionally creating this sense of the ocean and the depth. And I love the fishing pole here with the line of text going down. So this is an example of just like really beautiful, innovative typographic deconstruction, where the type is actually becoming part of the design itself, part of the image. And here's another example of Bradbury Thompson and some really beautiful design strategies. You can see here, he's center weighting this text, but he's almost making it look like the shape of an object, and he often would sort of overlay text on top of graphical elements. So you, in this next project that we start to work on, you are going to create compositions, and you're going to be given some text, some very specific text, an article by Beatrice Ward called Printing Should Be Invisible. And you are going to design 4 different layouts for that page of text. 2, you're going to use only one type, and then in 2 of them, you can mix typefaces and really be more experimental. So what I'd like you to do is maybe do one design that's, more traditional, and then really sort of go farther and stretch it farther as you go forward with each design, thinking maybe the last design is very experimental, kind of like typographic deconstruction.